I used to believe that betrayal had a sound, a slammed door, a raised voice, a confession whispered at midnight. But the deepest betrayal I ever experienced came in complete silence. It came folded inside legal paperwork and served to me while I was still recovering from surgery. My husband, Daniel Mercer, had filed for divorce. Not only that, he was accusing me of financial misconduct, emotional instability, and abandonment. According to the documents, I had checked out of the marriage months ago. According to his lawyer, I was an unreliable wife who couldn't be trusted with our shared assets. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, my stitches still tender, reading those words while my hands trembled so badly I could barely hold the pages. 22 years of marriage reduced to a paragraph of lies. Daniel had always been polished, the kind of man who knew exactly how to smile at the right moment. He worked in commercial real estate, wore tailored suits, and believed presentation was everything. For most of our marriage, I handled the home. I raised our 2 children. I managed the books quietly in the background. I trusted him with the big decisions. That trust, I would later learn, was my biggest mistake. The divorce filing didn't just ask for separation, it demanded the house, the retirement accounts, even primary custody of our youngest, Lily, who was 16 and still believed her father hung the moon. His argument was that I had been mentally and emotionally unfit after my recent health issues. I had undergone a hysterectomy that spring. Recovery had been slow. I was exhausted, foggy, vulnerable. Apparently, while I was healing, he was building a case. When I confronted him, he didn't yell. He didn't apologize. He simply said, "This is what's best for everyone." The coldness in his voice made me feel like I was speaking to a stranger. I asked him why he would claim I was unstable. He shrugged. "It's just strategy." Strategy? As if our marriage were a chess game and I was a disposable pawn. I hired a lawyer 2 days later. Her name was Patricia Klein. She was sharp, precise, and had the kind of eyes that noticed everything. When I handed her the paperwork, she read it without reacting. Then she looked at me and said, "He's confident." I asked what she meant. She tapped the page where his attorney's name was printed. He hired Raymond Calloway. He doesn't take cases he can't win. The implications settled in my chest like a stone. Daniel believed he had already won. The weeks leading up to court were suffocating. Friends began acting differently. Some avoided me, others offered pitying looks. I later learned Daniel had been quietly telling people I was struggling mentally, that I had become paranoid, that he was trying to protect the children. It was such a careful narrative, so reasonable, and because I had been out of social circulation during my recovery, I had no idea he was rewriting our story in my absence. The night before the hearing, I barely slept. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, replaying 22 years in my mind. The vacations, the late-night talks, the promises. I kept asking myself how a man could wake up one day and decide his wife was disposable. I kept wondering what I had missed. Patricia had prepared me. She warned that Raymond would try to rattle me, that Daniel might testify about my erratic behavior. I was to remain calm, composed, let the facts speak. Walking into that courtroom felt like stepping onto a stage where everyone already knew their lines except me. Daniel sat at the opposite table in a navy suit I had bought him for our 20th anniversary. He didn't look at me. Raymond leaned toward him, whispering something that made Daniel's mouth twitch upward in the faintest smirk. My stomach twisted. I felt small, alone. The hearing began with procedural matters. Then Raymond stood and delivered a speech so polished it might as well have been rehearsed for television. He spoke of concern, of stability, of a husband who had tried everything to help his struggling wife. He painted me as fragile, emotionally unpredictable, financially irresponsible. At one point, he referenced a bank transfer I made months ago, money I moved from savings to cover medical expenses. He suggested it was evidence of impulsive behavior. I felt heat crawl up my neck, but I stayed silent. Then Daniel took the stand. Hearing him describe our marriage as increasingly volatile felt surreal. He spoke calmly, measured. He claimed I had withdrawn, that I accused him of things without proof, that I had become suspicious and controlling. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, but instead I felt something crack inside my chest. This man had once held my hand during childbirth. Now he was testifying as if I were a liability. Patricia cross-examined him gently at first. She asked about his travel schedule, about certain financial accounts solely in his name. His answers were smooth. He denied nothing outright, but he minimized everything. I realized then that Daniel had prepared thoroughly. He had rehearsed. He had anticipated questions. He looked confident, almost relaxed. Midway through the proceedings, Raymond requested to introduce a surprise witness. My heart skipped. Patricia's jaw tightened, but she nodded. The judge allowed it. Raymond smiled faintly and said, "Your Honor, we call Miss Evelyn Hart." The name meant nothing to me, but Daniel's posture shifted almost imperceptibly. His shoulders stiffened. He didn't turn around as the courtroom doors opened. I did. A woman stepped inside, early 40s, tall, composed, dressed in understated gray. She carried a folder clutched tightly against her chest. For a fleeting moment, I assumed she was there to confirm Daniel's version of events, perhaps a therapist, a colleague, someone prepared to testify about my alleged instability. I braced myself. But then something strange happened. Daniel finally looked over his shoulder, and the color drained from his face. I saw it happen in real time. The confidence vanished. His jaw tightened. His eyes widened just slightly before he forced them back into neutrality. Raymond, too, seemed confused. He leaned toward Daniel, whispering urgently. Daniel didn't respond. Evelyn walked steadily to the witness stand. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at Daniel. She simply raised her hand and swore to tell the truth. The courtroom air felt charged, as if everyone sensed something had shifted but didn't yet understand how. Raymond began cautiously. "Miss Hart, could you state your relation to Mr. Mercer?" There was a pause, and then she said, clearly, calmly, "I am her former executive assistant, and I am here because I was subpoenaed." Daniel's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. My pulse roared in my ears. I didn't know who this woman was. I didn't know why she had been subpoenaed, but I knew one thing in that moment. She wasn't part of Daniel's plan, and whatever she was about to say had the power to change everything. Evelyn's voice was steady, almost detached, but there was something underneath it, something restrained. Raymond cleared his throat and attempted to regain control of the narrative. "Miss Hart, you were employed by Mr. Mercer for how long?" She folded her hands in her lap. 7 years. Daniel shifted in his seat, his jaw tight enough that I could see the muscle pulsing from across the room. Raymond nodded as though this was routine. "And during that time, you became familiar with his business practices?" "Very," she replied. Patricia sat beside me, suddenly alert in a way she hadn't been before. I felt it too, a subtle shift in gravity. Raymond hesitated before asking his next question, and that hesitation told me everything. He hadn't expected her tone. "Miss Hart, would you describe Mr. Mercer as a responsible professional?" There it was, the softball question, the safe setup. Evelyn didn't answer immediately. She glanced briefly toward Daniel, not with affection, not with resentment, but with something closer to disappointment. "He is meticulous," she said finally. "He plans carefully. He documents everything." Raymond smiled, relieved. Daniel exhaled faintly, but Evelyn wasn't finished. "He also maintains multiple financial accounts that are not disclosed to his spouse." The silence that followed felt like a vacuum. My heart seemed to stop mid-beat. Patricia's hand slowly moved to her pen. Raymond blinked. "I'm sorry, could you clarify?" Evelyn opened the folder she had brought. "During my employment, I was instructed to manage several off-ledger accounts tied to shell corporations registered in Nevada and Delaware. These accounts received transfers from joint marital funds." The words landed like stones in still water. Daniel's attorney froze. Daniel himself had gone utterly still. The judge leaned forward slightly. Patricia rose calmly. "Your Honor, I was not made aware of this witness until moments ago, but I would like permission to review those documents." The judge nodded. Evelyn handed the folder to the bailiff, who passed it to Patricia. I watched Patricia's eyes scan the first page, then the second. Her expression didn't change, but I saw the faintest tightening at the corners of her mouth. She had found something. Raymond stood abruptly. "Your Honor, I object to this line of testimony. This hearing concerns Mrs. Mercer's alleged instability and custodial fitness." The judge's gaze sharpened. "Counselor, financial concealment within a marriage is relevant in a divorce proceeding." Raymond swallowed. Daniel's composure was gone now. He leaned toward his lawyer, whispering urgently. I could see a sheen of sweat forming at his temple. Evelyn continued speaking, her voice calm. "Approximately 14 months ago, Mr. Mercer instructed me to transfer $250,000 from a joint investment account into a newly formed LLC. My breath caught. 14 months ago. That was before my surgery, before any supposed instability. Patricia stood slowly. "Miss Hart, were these transfers disclosed to to Mrs. Mercer?" "No," Evelyn answered. "In fact, Mr. Mercer was explicit that his wife was not to be informed." I felt as though the floor beneath me had shifted. The accusations of financial irresponsibility, the suggestion that I had been reckless, all the while he had been siphoning money quietly, methodically. The judge turned toward Daniel. "Mr. Mercer, is this accurate?" Daniel straightened, attempting to regain control. "These were business arrangements, perfectly legal." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. Patricia's tone was razor sharp when she spoke next. "Business arrangements that involved marital assets, Your Honor." Raymond interjected again, but his earlier confidence had evaporated. Evelyn was asked how she came to be subpoenaed. She explained that after leaving Daniel's employment 6 months prior, she had been contacted by Patricia's office. Patricia had discovered irregularities during preliminary discovery, numbers that didn't add up. Evelyn had agreed to cooperate fully. I turned slowly toward Patricia, stunned. She gave me the smallest nod, as if to say, "I told you he was confident." The courtroom felt different now, the air heavier, the power dynamic had shifted, and everyone could feel it. Daniel was no longer the composed, wronged husband. He looked cornered. Raymond attempted damage control. "Miss Hart, are you suggesting criminal behavior?" Evelyn chose her words carefully. "I am stating that funds were moved deliberately to reduce the appearance of shared assets prior to the filing of divorce." There it was, strategy, the same word Daniel had used with me in our kitchen, strategy. But this strategy had a paper trail, and suddenly his narrative about my instability began to look like something else entirely, a distraction. The judge called for a brief recess. As we stood, Daniel finally looked at me, really looked at me, and in his eyes, for the first time in months, I saw fear. Not anger, not superiority, fear. I didn't feel triumph. I felt something quieter, a slow, steady unraveling of the illusion he had built. In the hallway, Patricia spoke in low, urgent tones. "This changes everything," she said. "If we can establish intent to conceal assets, his credibility collapses." I leaned against the cool marble wall, trying to steady my breathing. "Did you know she would say all that?" I asked. Patricia's lips curved faintly. I knew she had documents. I didn't know how far he'd gone. When court resumed, the judge's demeanor had shifted. The focus was no longer solely on my alleged instability, it was on Daniel's financial conduct. Patricia moved decisively, requesting a temporary injunction on all accounts pending full forensic review. Raymond objected weakly. The judge overruled him. Daniel's mask cracked fully then. His responses became clipped, defensive. He contradicted himself twice within 10 minutes. Evelyn remained composed throughout, answering only what was asked. She never once looked in my direction, but I felt an odd sense of gratitude toward her, not because she was destroying him, but because she was telling the truth. By the end of the session, the judge ordered a comprehensive audit of all financial holdings and postponed any custody determinations until further review. As the gavel struck, the sound echoed louder than it should have. Daniel gathered his papers with trembling hands. Raymond avoided eye contact entirely. I remained seated for a moment longer, absorbing what had just happened. I had walked into that courtroom feeling small, prepared to defend my sanity. I walked out knowing that the man who had tried to paint me as unstable had been hiding far more than he ever accused me of. But even then, I didn't know the full extent of it, because what Evelyn had revealed was only the surface, and the deeper truth, the one that would truly turn Daniel white, had not yet been spoken aloud. I didn't sleep the night after that hearing. Not because I was afraid anymore, but because something inside me had awakened. For months I had been moving through fog, doubting my memory, questioning my instincts, wondering if maybe I really had missed something, maybe I really had become difficult, maybe my surgery had changed me in ways I couldn't see. That's what gaslighting does. It doesn't just make you question events, it makes you question yourself. But as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I replayed Daniel's face when Evelyn walked in. That wasn't the face of a man concerned about his unstable wife. That was the face of a man whose secret had just found a microphone. Patricia called me early the next morning. Her voice carried a restrained energy. "I need you to come in," she said. "We've started going through the documents." I drove to her office with my stomach in knots, not sure what I was bracing for. She had spread papers across her conference table like pieces of a puzzle. Account numbers, transfer logs, corporate registrations. "He didn't just move money," she said quietly. "He created an entire infrastructure." She explained that the shell corporations Evelyn mentioned weren't dormant, they were active. They owned property, commercial property, purchased within the last year. My head began to spin. "With our money?" I asked. Patricia nodded. "With marital funds." I sank into the chair across from her. 22 years of shared effort, of budgeting carefully, of postponing vacations because Daniel claimed we needed liquidity for investments. I remembered the arguments when I asked about upgrading the kitchen. He said we couldn't justify it. I remembered him frowning over tuition discussions for Lily's college savings. All the while, he had been funneling money into assets hidden behind corporate names I'd never heard before. "And there's more," Patricia continued. She slid another document toward me. It was a timeline. The transfers began almost 18 months before he filed for divorce. 18 months. That meant he had been planning this while still kissing me goodbye in the mornings, while holding my hand at doctor appointments, while telling me everything would be okay after surgery. The betrayal wasn't impulsive. It was methodical. "What about custody?" I asked, my voice small despite my effort to sound steady. Patricia leaned back. "His claim that you're financially irresponsible collapses if he's proven to have concealed assets. It calls his credibility into question across the board." I exhaled slowly. Lily, my sweet, observant girl who had been confused by her father's sudden protectiveness. He had been whispering to her, too, telling her mom needed space, that mom was fragile. I wondered how much of that narrative would survive once the truth surfaced. Over the next 2 weeks, forensic accountants dug deeper. Each new discovery felt like peeling back wallpaper to find rot underneath. There were emails, careful coded exchanges between Daniel and a private broker, instructions to reallocate before disclosure deadlines, discussions about minimizing exposure. The language was clinical, strategic, cold. Patricia prepared motions with the precision of a surgeon. She requested full financial transparency under threat of sanctions. Raymond's responses grew shorter, less confident. Then came the second hearing. This time, the courtroom felt different from the moment I stepped inside. Word travels quickly in legal circles. I could sense the subtle shift in attention. Daniel arrived late, his tie slightly crooked. He avoided looking at me entirely. Raymond looked tired. The judge wasted no time. "Mr. Mercer," she began, "you are ordered to provide complete disclosure of all corporate entities connected to you within 72 hours. Daniel cleared his throat. "Your Honor, these are legitimate business holdings. Business holdings acquired during the marriage," the judge replied sharply. Patricia presented a summary from the forensic team. Numbers filled the room, totals that made my chest tighten, properties valued well beyond what Daniel had ever reported at home. The judge's expression hardened with each page. "Additionally," Patricia said calmly, "we have reason to believe Mr. Mercer intended to liquidate one of these properties immediately following the divorce decree." A murmur rippled faintly through the courtroom. Daniel's head snapped up. "That's speculation." Patricia didn't blink. "We have the listing agreement draft dated 2 weeks before he filed." Daniel's composure cracked then, not dramatically, not loudly, but unmistakably. He ran a hand through his hair, something he only did when cornered. I had seen that gesture before during business setbacks, but this was different. This wasn't a deal gone wrong. This was his narrative unraveling in public. The judge turned to Evelyn, who had been recalled briefly to clarify document authentication. "Ms. Hart, were you aware of any plans to disclose these holdings to Mrs. Mercer prior to the divorce filing?" Evelyn met the judge's eyes. "No, Your Honor. In fact, Mr. Mercer instructed that financial summaries provided to his spouse exclude these entities." The room went utterly still. Exclude these entities. It was such a sterile phrase, so professional, and yet it carried the weight of deliberate deception. I felt something inside me settle. Not anger, not vindication, just clarity. For months I had been told I was overreacting, that I was suspicious without cause, that I imagined distance where there was none. But my instincts hadn't been paranoia, they had been perception. When the judge announced a temporary freeze on all asset transfers pending full investigation, Daniel's lawyer visibly deflated. His strategy of portraying me as unstable had backfired spectacularly. Now the focus wasn't my mental health, it was his integrity. But the deepest blow came unexpectedly. Patricia requested permission to submit one final piece of evidence, an email chain printed in black and white. She handed copies to the court. "This correspondence," she said evenly, "is between Mr. Mercer and a private law consultant 3 months prior to his wife's medical procedure." My pulse quickened. Daniel stared at the table. The judge read silently for a moment. Then her eyes lifted slowly. "Mr. Mercer, is it accurate that you sought consultation regarding divorce strategy before your wife's medical procedure?" Daniel swallowed. "I was exploring options." Options. The word echoed hollowly. Exploring options while I was terrified about anesthesia, while I was crying in hospital parking lots, while I believed my husband was holding me together. The judge's voice sharpened. "And in these emails you refer to timing the filing to coincide with her recovery period, to strengthen claims of instability. Do you deny writing this?" The color drained from his face in a way that was almost surreal to witness. For a split second, he looked like a man who had just realized the walls were no longer where he thought they were. "Those emails are being taken out of context," he managed. But there was no context that could soften those words. timed to coincide, strengthen claims, strategy. I felt a strange calm wash over me, the kind that comes not from triumph, but from truth finally stepping into the light. The narrative he had built that I was fragile, unreliable, emotionally unfit was collapsing under the weight of his own documentation. When court adjourned, Daniel didn't look at me as he passed. He walked quickly, almost stiffly, toward the exit. Raymond followed in silence. Evelyn lingered only long enough to confirm with Patricia that she would remain available if needed. As she turned to leave, our eyes met for the first time. There was no smile, no alliance, just a quiet acknowledgement. Truth had done its job. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different, lighter. Reporters hadn't gathered. This wasn't that kind of case, but for me it felt monumental. I had entered this process afraid I would lose everything, my home, my daughter, my dignity. Instead, I was beginning to see that the only thing I had truly lost was the illusion of the man I married. And the investigation wasn't over, because as the accountants continued their review, they uncovered something that made even Patricia pause before speaking, something that wasn't just about hidden money, something that would reveal why Daniel had been so desperate to erase me completely. 3 days after the second hearing, Patricia called me into her office again. By then, I had grown accustomed to the careful tone she used when something significant had surfaced. But this time, when I stepped into the conference room, the atmosphere felt heavier. The forensic accountant was there too, a quiet man named Mr. Hargrove, who rarely spoke unless necessary. Several new folders sat stacked neatly on the table. Patricia didn't ask me to sit right away. She simply said, "We need to talk about one of the properties." I lowered myself into the chair, bracing. "It's not just commercial real estate," she continued. "One of the LLCs owns a residential property purchased 11 months ago." My mind flickered through possibilities, a rental investment, a flip, something explainable. "Where?" I asked. 40 minutes outside the city, suburban, 3-bedroom home." Something about the way she paused before saying the next words made my stomach tighten. "The utility records show consistent occupancy." I stared at her, not fully understanding. Occupied by whom? Patricia slid a photograph across the table. It was taken from a listing archive before the property was removed from public view. A modest 2-story house, white siding, blue shutters. Ordinary, completely ordinary, and yet it felt like looking at a fracture in reality. "The utilities are registered under the LLC," she said carefully, "but there are secondary service records, school enrollment documents tied to the address." My heart began pounding. "School enrollment?" Mr. Hargrove cleared his throat gently. "There is a child registered at that address, 8 years old." The room seemed to tilt. I blinked, certain I had misheard. "Daniel and I don't have an 8-year-old." "No," Patricia said quietly, "you don't." Silence expanded between us. My mind scrambled for rational explanations. A tenant, a relative, a temporary arrangement, anything but the truth forming at the edges of my consciousness. Patricia slid another document forward, birth records, the father's name listed plainly, Daniel Mercer. I felt the blood drain from my face. It was as if every sound in the building had been sucked away. I could see Patricia speaking, but for a moment I couldn't hear her. 8 years old. That meant conception 14 years into our marriage. That meant while we were planning anniversaries, while we were discussing retirement, while I was believing we were stable. "He has a second family," Patricia said gently. The words didn't shatter me the way I would have expected. They didn't explode. They settled, cold, heavy, almost clinical. I had already processed betrayal in layers, the financial deception, the strategic divorce timing. This was another layer, but somehow it clarified everything. The urgency, the need to portray me as unstable, the push for full asset control. If he could paint me as unfit and secure the majority of marital funds, he could fund that hidden life cleanly, seamlessly, without disruption. I pressed my palms flat against the table to steady myself. Does Lily know? No evidence of contact between the households, Mr. Hargrove said gently. This appears fully compartmentalized. Compartmentalized, like files in a cabinet, like I had been, wife in one drawer, other life in another. Driving home that afternoon, I felt strangely detached. The sky looked the same, traffic moved normally, people laughed on sidewalks. The world had not tilted off its axis, but mine had. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I drove carefully, hands steady on the wheel, replaying moments from the past decade, business trips that lasted a little too long, weekends he claimed were conferences, a subtle emotional distance I had once attributed to stress. The pieces align now with brutal clarity. That evening, Lily sat at the kitchen counter doing homework. She looked up when I walked in. "How was court?" she asked softly. There was worry in her eyes, confusion too. I studied her face, the shape of her father's jaw. My own eyes reflected back at me. How do you protect your child from a truth that could fracture her understanding of family? I forced a small smile. It's complicated, I said honestly, but the truth is coming out. She nodded slowly, trusting me, and in that moment I knew with absolute certainty that I would not let Daniel's lies rewrite her childhood. 2 days later, Patricia filed an emergency motion to expand financial discovery based on newly uncovered dependents. The courtroom was quieter this time, more restrained. Daniel entered looking pale, thinner somehow. When the judge addressed the new findings, the air grew electric. "Mr. Mercer," she said firmly, "are you the biological father of the minor child residing at the Meadowbrook property?" There it was. No euphemisms, no corporate shielding, just plain language. Daniel's throat moved as he swallowed. For a brief second, he glanced toward Raymond as if hoping for rescue. None came. "Yes," he said hoarsely. The word echoed. I watched his face, not with hatred, but with a strange curiosity. This was the man who'd once told me honesty was the foundation of everything, the man who'd looked me in the eye and promised we had no secrets. The judge's voice was cool. Why was this child and the associated property not disclosed during initial proceedings? Daniel attempted composure. "It's complicated." Patricia didn't let the moment breathe. "Your Honor, we submit that Mr. Mercer's attempt to secure majority assets while concealing an entire dependent household demonstrates intentional financial manipulation." The judge agreed to broaden the scope immediately. Custody discussions were suspended indefinitely, pending full review of character and transparency. Daniel looked as if the floor had vanished beneath him. His carefully crafted strategy, portraying me as unstable to gain leverage, had detonated under the weight of his own secrets. As proceedings adjourned, I remained seated for a moment, absorbing the magnitude of it all. Not just the betrayal, but the sheer audacity. He hadn't simply fallen in love elsewhere. He'd engineered a parallel existence, funded it with shared money, timed his divorce around my vulnerability, and expected to walk away clean. Outside, the autumn air felt sharper. I stood on the courthouse steps, breathing slowly. Reporters still hadn't gathered, but a few onlookers whispered as Daniel exited separately, avoiding my gaze. For the first time in months, I didn't feel small standing there. I felt anchored, rooted in something solid. That night, alone in my bedroom, I finally allowed myself to cry. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet tears for the marriage I thought I had, for the years I had unknowingly shared him, for the version of my life that no longer existed. But beneath the grief was something steady, resolve. because here is the truth no one tells you about betrayal. Once it is fully exposed, it loses its power to control you. Secrets thrive in shadows. Daniel had built his strategy in darkness, believing I would crumble under accusation. But light changes everything. And the investigation was still unfolding. Financial penalties were now on the table, possible sanctions, even legal consequences beyond family court. Raymond's tone in filings had shifted from aggressive to defensive. Daniel's image in professional circles was beginning to fracture. Word spreads quietly when integrity is questioned. But the deepest shift wasn't in court. It was inside me. The woman who had once doubted her sanity was gone. In her place stood someone clearer, stronger, not because I had won yet, but because I no longer questioned what I knew. Daniel had tried to erase me by painting me as unstable. He had timed his filing around my surgery, believing vulnerability meant weakness. He had hidden money, property, and a child, and he expected the court to accept his narrative without question. But instead, the so-called surprise witness cracked the door. The financial records blew it open, and the hidden life behind that suburban house tore the entire structure down. But there was still one more confrontation left, one conversation that had not yet happened, not in a courtroom, not before a judge, just him and me. And I knew sooner or later he would have to look me in the eye and explain why 22 years were never enough. The confrontation happened on a Tuesday evening, just as the sun was dipping low enough to turn the windows gold. It wasn't planned. There were no lawyers, no judges, no witnesses, just the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the weight of everything unsaid sitting between us. Daniel let himself into the house with his key, something that startled me more than it should have. For a moment, I considered asking him to leave, but I didn't. Some part of me knew this conversation had to happen without an audience. He stood in the doorway to the kitchen, looking older than I remembered. Not dramatically, not broken, just worn. His usual polish was gone. No tailored jacket, no controlled posture, just a man stripped of narrative. "I need to talk to you," he said. I didn't invite him to sit. I didn't offer him coffee. I simply leaned back against the counter and waited. He ran a hand over his face. "You weren't supposed to find out like this." I let out a soft breath. "Like what? In a courtroom with documentation?" His jaw tightened. "It wasn't that simple." It's almost laughable how often betrayal tries to disguise itself as complexity. I folded my arms. "Then make it simple." He stared at the floor for a long moment before speaking. "Her name is Marissa. We met at a conference 9 years ago." 9 years. That meant Lily was 7. That meant our home had still been loud with school recitals and weekend barbecues. "It wasn't planned," he continued. "It just happened." I didn't interrupt. I had learned in court that silence forces truth to fill the space. "When she got pregnant, I panicked," he said quietly. "I didn't want to lose everything." Everything. The word echoed differently now. "So you created a second everything," I replied. He flinched slightly. "I thought I could manage both." Manage, like accounts, like assets. "And when I got sick?" I asked. He looked up then, finally meeting my eyes. There was guilt there, real guilt. That complicated things. I let the bitterness settle before speaking. "You mean it made your exit strategy easier?" He didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it either, but his silence told me enough. "I didn't think you'd fight this hard," he admitted. That sentence surprised me more than anything else he'd said, not because it was cruel, but because it revealed how small he had allowed his perception of me to become. Somewhere along the way, he had reduced me to someone fragile, someone who would crumble under pressure, someone who would accept a narrative handed to her. "I didn't know I had to," I said quietly. "I thought I was married." The room fell silent again. "I never stopped caring about you," he offered weakly. I shook my head. Caring isn't the same as honoring. That landed. I could see it. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him, not because he had been exposed, but because he had built a life so compartmentalized that it finally collapsed under its own weight. Living two realities requires constant calculation, constant vigilance, and eventually cracks form. "Does she know about the divorce strategy?" I asked. His eyes flickered. "She knows some of it." "Of course she did. There are no secrets in a secret life." "I was trying to secure stability for everyone," he said defensively. "By dismantling me," I replied calmly. He looked away. There it was again, that refusal to sit fully in what he had done. "I won't destroy her," I said after a long pause, "or the child." He seemed surprised by that. "But I will not carry the cost of your deception, not financially, not emotionally, not in Lily's eyes." At the mention of Lily, his posture shifted. "She doesn't need to know the details." "She needs the truth," I said firmly. "Age appropriate, but truthful. You don't get to rewrite this story for her." He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. The reality was settling in for him now. The financial audit would divide assets differently than he'd planned. His credibility had been damaged. Custody would likely remain shared, if not weighted in my favor, and the narrative he had crafted about my instability was unraveling in quiet, undeniable ways. "I didn't mean to hurt you like this," he said finally. That's the thing about betrayal. The hurt is rarely accidental. The exposure might be, but the deception requires intention. "You didn't mean to get caught like this," I corrected gently. He didn't argue. We stood there, two people who once shared a bed, now separated by choices neither of us could undo. "I don't hate you," I said, surprising even myself. "But I see you clearly now. Clarity can be more devastating than anger." He nodded slowly, as if accepting a verdict that hadn't been delivered by a judge. When he left that evening, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt complete in a way I hadn't in months. The confrontation hadn't been explosive. There were no slammed doors, no dramatic declarations, just truth laid bare between two adults. Over the next several weeks, the legal proceedings moved steadily toward resolution. The expanded audit confirmed significant concealment. The court ordered equitable redistribution, factoring in his disclosed dependent. Sanctions were issued for non-disclosure. His attempt to frame me as unstable was formally dismissed in written findings. Seeing that in black and white, claims unsubstantiated, felt like oxygen returning to lungs that had been compressed for months. Lily handled the adjusted narrative with quiet strength. We told her together, though I led the conversation. Age-appropriate truth, that her father had made choices outside the marriage, that adults sometimes fail in complicated ways. She cried, she asked questions, she withdrew for a few days, but children sense authenticity. And because I didn't lie to protect his image, she didn't lose trust in me. Daniel's professional life shifted too. Not catastrophically, but enough. Partnerships cooled, invitations thinned, reputation matters in quiet ways. As for me, I began rebuilding in small, deliberate steps. I reopened a consulting practice I had once paused to support his career. I renovated the kitchen I had postponed for years, not extravagantly, but intentionally. Every cabinet felt symbolic, every decision mine. Sometimes people ask if the surprise witness saved me. The truth is, she didn't save me. She revealed the truth. The saving part, that was mine, because I had to choose not to shrink under accusation. I had to choose to trust my instincts. I had to choose not to let his strategy define my worth. When I think back to the day Evelyn walked into that courtroom and Daniel went white, I realized something profound. His fear wasn't of punishment, it was of exposure. He could manage two lives as long as they remained compartmentalized, but truth collapses compartments. And here's the lesson I carry now, the one I hope you carry too. If someone has to weaken you to win, they were never strong to begin with. And when truth walks into the room, no matter how late, it has a way of restoring balance. I lost a husband, but I found my voice. And that, in the end, was worth far more than any hidden property could ever be. In the weeks after the confrontation, something unexpected happened. The world didn't end. It didn't explode into chaos the way I once imagined it might if my marriage ever collapsed. Instead, it shifted quietly. Papers were filed, accounts were reviewed, schedules were adjusted. Life reorganized itself in practical, almost boring ways. And in that quiet reorganization, I began to feel something unfamiliar: space. For months, every thought had revolved around defense, defending my sanity, my integrity, my motherhood. Now, suddenly, I wasn't defending anything. The court's written findings had been entered into record. Daniel's allegations regarding my instability were described as unsupported and strategically timed. Reading those words felt like watching a stain being lifted from fabric. It didn't erase what had happened, but it restored clarity. The asset division process was thorough. The hidden properties were valued and brought into the marital estate. The suburban house, the one that had held his second life, remained under his responsibility, but its equity was calculated properly. The shell corporations were no longer shadows, they were numbers on paper, transparent, accounted for, controlled. Daniel's demeanor changed during those final proceedings. He no longer tried to dominate the room. He spoke carefully, sometimes too carefully, as if every word had to pass through a filter of consequence. Raymond rarely objected anymore. The fight had drained out of their strategy. Lily adjusted in ways that surprised me. Teenagers often process pain in private, but she began spending more time in the kitchen while I cooked. She would sit on the counter and talk about school, about friends, about ordinary things. The normalcy was healing. One evening she asked quietly, "Mom, did you always know something was wrong?" I considered the question carefully. "I felt something," I said, "but I didn't have proof. And sometimes when you love someone, you doubt your own instincts." She nodded thoughtfully. "I'm glad you didn't doubt yourself forever." That sentence settled deep inside me, because that was the turning point, wasn't it? Not the courtroom, not the witness, not even the hidden child. It was the moment I stopped questioning my own perception. As the legal dust settled, I began meeting with a financial advisor, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. For the first time in decades, I was planning my future without filtering it through Daniel's preferences. I reopened my consulting work more formally, reaching out to old contacts. Some responded immediately, warmly. Others admitted they had heard rumors, but were relieved to see me steady and clear-eyed. Reputation rebuilds quietly, too. There were moments, of course, when grief would surface unexpectedly. I would pass a restaurant where we once celebrated anniversaries. I would find an old photo tucked into a drawer. The loss wasn't just of a husband, it was of a shared history I had believed in wholeheartedly. Mourning that required patience with myself. Daniel and I communicated primarily through structured channels now: email threads regarding Lily's schedule, financial updates, logistical matters. Occasionally, there would be a sentence that hinted at something softer, a memory reference, a polite inquiry about my health. But the intimacy was gone, and strangely, that absence didn't hurt the way I thought it would. It felt honest. The first holiday after the court's decision was Thanksgiving. Lily chose to split the day between us. I spent the morning cooking in the renovated kitchen, sunlight pouring across countertops I had chosen myself. Friends came by in the afternoon, people who had stood by me quietly during the uncertainty. There was laughter, real laughter, the kind that doesn't carry tension underneath. That evening, after Lily left for her father's house, I sat alone for a moment at the dining table. The house was quieter than it used to be, but it wasn't hollow. It felt intentional, mine. I thought about Evelyn once in a while, about the courage it must have taken to step into that courtroom knowing the ripple effects it would create. We never became friends. There were no dramatic thank you speeches, but sometimes gratitude exists best in silence. Months passed, the legal case formally closed, the sanctions Daniel received were financial, not criminal. The court had no appetite for spectacle, only correction, and correction had been delivered. One afternoon, nearly a year after that first shocking hearing, I received a handwritten letter in the mail. The envelope bore unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a brief note from Marissa. I read it slowly. She wrote that she had learned details about the divorce strategy only after proceedings began, that she had believed Daniel was separated long before he claimed to be, that she had not known about the asset concealment. She did not ask for forgiveness, she did not defend him, she simply acknowledged that harm had been done. I sat with the letter for a long time. There is a strange complexity in realizing the other woman may have also been living inside partial truths. I didn't excuse her role, but I recognized something important. Deception rarely isolates itself to one target, it spreads. I did not respond to her letter, not out of anger, but out of closure. Closure doesn't require ongoing dialogue, it requires acceptance. As for Daniel, our interactions gradually softened into something almost civil, not friendly, not warm, but respectful. He attended Lily's school events, we stood on opposite sides of auditoriums, occasionally our eyes would meet and there would be a shared understanding, not of reconciliation, but of consequence. Once, after a parent-teacher conference, he said quietly, "You were right to fight." It wasn't an apology, but it was an acknowledgement, and sometimes acknowledgement is the closest thing you'll receive to remorse. Looking back now, I realize the courtroom moment, the day he and his lawyer went white, wasn't the climax of my story. It was the pivot, the visible crack in a structure that had been weakening for years. The real transformation happened afterwards, in the steady rebuilding, in the reclaiming of voice, in the refusal to internalize lies. If you're listening to my story and you're in the middle of your own betrayal, here's what I want you to understand. Exposure may feel like destruction at first, but often it's renovation, painful, dusty, disorienting, but necessary. Daniel tried to dismantle me strategically. He believed vulnerability equaled weakness. He believed narrative equaled truth, but narrative collapses when facts enter the room. The surprise witness didn't just shock a courtroom, she shattered a false story. And once that story broke, I had the space to write my own. Today, when I walk through my home, I don't see the remnants of a failed marriage. I see evidence of survival, of discernment, of strength I didn't know I possessed until I needed it. I lost the illusion of permanence, but I gained something far more durable, self-trust. And that, more than any court ruling, is truly what turned everything around. Time has a quiet way of smoothing sharp edges, but it doesn't erase the shape of what happened. About 18 months after the divorce was finalized, I found myself standing in the same courthouse, but this time not for a hearing. I had been invited to speak at a small legal seminar Patricia occasionally hosted for women navigating complex divorces. When she first asked me, I hesitated. I wasn't sure I wanted my story to become a lesson, but she said something that stayed with me. Your voice might steady someone else's. So I agreed. The room that afternoon wasn't large, a circle of chairs, coffee and paper cups, tension woven into the air the way it had once been woven into my bones. I recognized the look in some of the women's eyes, the blend of confusion and defiance, the internal question of whether they were overreacting or underestimating what they sensed. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't dramatize anything. I simply told the truth. I described the paperwork arriving while I was still healing, the courtroom, the surprise witness, the hidden assets, the second family. I watched their faces shift as the pieces fell into place, and then I said something I hadn't articulated fully before. The most dangerous part wasn't the money or the affair, it was the narrative. He tried to convince the world and me that I was unstable. If I had accepted that story, I would have signed away everything. There were nods around the circle. Afterward, a woman approached me quietly. She was in her early 40s, hands trembling slightly. "How did you know you weren't the unstable one?" she asked. I smiled gently. "I didn't, not at first, but instability doesn't document bank transfers 18 months in advance." She let out a small, shaky laugh. Humor can be medicine when truth feels too heavy. Life with Lily continued evolving. She grew taller, more independent. College brochures began arriving in the mail. We toured campuses together, sometimes in silence, sometimes in bursts of conversation about her future. Watching her imagine a life beyond our fractured family filled me with a bittersweet pride. She had weathered something significant, and she had not become cynical. That felt like victory. Daniel remained present in her life. We attended her high school graduation, sitting several seats apart, but clapping at the same moment. When she crossed the stage, our eyes met briefly, not with resentment, but with shared awe at the young woman we had raised. In that instant, the years of betrayal faded behind a single, undeniable truth. We had both loved her. Whatever else he had broken, that fact remained intact. Professionally, I found unexpected momentum. Clients respected resilience. They didn't need the full story, they sensed steadiness. The consulting work expanded. I hired a part-time assistant. The irony of that detail was not lost on me. Where once I had supported Daniel's empire quietly, now I was building something of my own, transparent, deliberate, clean. Occasionally, news of Daniel's other household filtered through mutual acquaintances. Nothing scandalous, just ordinary life updates. The child growing, Marissa working part-time. I didn't seek the information, but I didn't flinch from it either. There is a peculiar freedom in no longer competing for a position you no longer want. One evening, nearly 2 years after that first explosive court appearance, Daniel asked if we could talk, not at the house, not privately, just coffee in a public place. I considered declining, but curiosity outweighed reluctance. We met at a cafe mid-afternoon. He looked different again, less strained than before, but humbler somehow. After a few polite exchanges, he said, "I've been in therapy." I didn't respond immediately. It had to understand why I compartmentalized the way I did, why I thought control meant security. There was no defensiveness in his voice this time, just reflection. "I can't undo what I did," he said quietly, "but I can own it." Ownership. It's amazing how powerful that word becomes after years of evasion. "I don't need an apology to move forward," I told him honestly, "but Lily needs a father who doesn't rewrite history." He nodded. "She gets the truth now." That mattered. We sat in a silence that wasn't hostile, just settled, the kind of silence that exists between two people who have finally stopped fighting over the same version of reality. Driving home afterward, I realized something subtle but important. I no longer needed him to feel small for me to feel whole. His regret, if genuine, was his to process. My strength was no longer tied to his failure. Sometimes when I reflect on the moment Evelyn walked into that courtroom, I replay the image of Daniel's face draining of color. At the time, it felt like vindication. Now it feels like inevitability. Secrets accumulate weight. Eventually, they collapse under it. But the story isn't really about him turning white. It's about me refusing to fade. I think about the version of myself sitting at that kitchen table with divorce papers trembling in her hands. The woman who wondered if maybe she really was unstable, if maybe she had imagined the distance. I want to reach back through time and tell her something simple. Trust what you see. Trust what you feel. Facts may take time to surface, but they surface. Betrayal strips you down to essentials. It removes illusions. It forces clarity. And clarity, though painful, is powerful. Today, my home feels steady, not because nothing difficult has happened, but because nothing hidden remains. Transparency is peace. I sleep deeply. I make decisions without seeking silent approval. I renovate, travel, plan, and breathe without calculating someone else's secret agenda. If there's one final lesson threaded through all of this, it's this. When someone tries to win by weakening you, they reveal their own fragility. Strength does not require deception, love does not require strategy, and truth, no matter delayed, has a way of walking into the room exactly when it's needed. The surprise witness didn't just change a court case, it illuminated a life I had been living in partial shadow. And once the light came on, I chose never to dim myself again. There's something no one tells you about surviving betrayal. After the court dates are over, after the documents are signed, after the dramatic reveals fade into memory, there's a long stretch of ordinary days. And those ordinary days are where the real healing happens. It isn't cinematic. It isn't loud. It's grocery lists and quiet evenings. It's paying bills without wondering what account they were secretly drawn from. It's waking up without bracing for emotional impact. The final court order arrived on a gray Monday morning. I stood at the kitchen counter, my kitchen, fully mine now, and read through the last page slowly. Assets divided equitably, sanctions imposed, custody structured clearly, no mention of instability, no shadow over my name, just clean language. Final. I set the papers down and expected to feel fireworks. Instead, I felt stillness, a deep, steady stillness. For years, my life had been tied to Daniel's rhythm, his career moves, his ambitions, his subtle expectations. Even my doubts had orbited around him. Now there was no orbit. I was no longer revolving around someone else's gravity. Lily left for college that fall. We packed her car together, folding clothes into plastic bins and arguing lightly about how many shoes she actually needed. When we reached campus and began unloading, I felt the familiar ache of transition. Not loss, just change. Before I left her dorm room, she hugged me tightly and said, "You showed me what strength looks like, Mom." I almost broke then, not because I needed praise, but because I realized something profound. My greatest fear during the divorce hadn't been losing assets. It had been losing credibility in my daughter's eyes. Daniel's strategy had centered on that, painting me as unstable to secure advantage. But truth has a way of imprinting itself clearly on children. She had watched me stay calm. She had watched me refuse to shout or spiral. She had watched me stand up quietly and persistently. That was the legacy I carried out of that courthouse. Not money, not property, but example. The house felt emptier after she left. For a few weeks, I wandered from room to room, adjusting to the silence. But instead of loneliness, I felt possibility. I turned Lily's old bedroom into a reading space. I planted a small garden in the backyard. I traveled alone for the first time in decades, just a weekend by the coast with no schedule and no one expecting me to be anything other than present. Healing, I learned, is cumulative. It's built in small, consistent acts of self-respect. Daniel and I settled into a rhythm of respectful distance. We spoke when necessary. Occasionally, we even laughed over a shared memory related to Lily's childhood. Not romantically, not nostalgically, just as two people who once built something meaningful, even if they couldn't preserve it. I stopped needing him to understand the full weight of what he had done. That realization surprised me most of all. In the early days, I had wanted acknowledgement, deep, articulate remorse. But as time passed, I understood something critical. Closure doesn't come from someone else's comprehension. It comes from your own. The surprise witness, Evelyn, crossed my mind often during that first year of independence. One afternoon, I ran into her unexpectedly at a bookstore downtown. We both paused, startled, then smiled politely. "I'm glad it ended fairly," she said simply. "So am I replied. There was no dramatic exchange, no lingering tension, just mutual recognition. She had stepped into truth when it would have been easier to stay silent. I respected that deeply. After she left, I lingered among the shelves and thought about how fragile stability can seem when it's built on deception and how strong it becomes when rebuilt on honesty. Over time, friends began asking if I would ever date again. The question used to unsettle me. The idea of trusting someone after living through strategic betrayal felt reckless. But I realized something important. What broke my marriage wasn't vulnerability, it was dishonesty. I wasn't afraid of love, I was afraid of illusion. So I approached connection differently, slowly, with clarity. I asked direct questions, I listened carefully to answers, and more importantly, I listened to myself. There was one evening in particular that stands out. I was sitting on my back porch watching the sun dip behind the fence line when a sudden wave of gratitude washed over me, not for the pain, but for the exposure of it. If Daniel had succeeded in portraying me as unstable, if I had shrunk under that accusation, I might have spent years doubting myself. I might have apologized for instincts that were accurate. I might have handed over control to someone who had already proven willing to manipulate it. But truth has a way of entering a courtroom in the form of a composed woman carrying a folder. And that truth forced everything into alignment. I think about the look on Daniel's face when Evelyn first stood the stand. At the time, it felt like the climax of a story. Now it feels like a turning point in mine. Because here's what I understand now. His fear in that moment wasn't about punishment. It was about losing control of the narrative. When you control the narrative, you control perception. But perception built on lies collapses under documentation. The day his lawyer went white, it wasn't just because evidence surfaced. It was because strategy met accountability, and accountability changes everything. As I close this chapter of my life, I carry a lesson that feels both simple and profound. Trust is not blind. It's built on transparency. And when transparency disappears, your intuition will whisper before proof ever arrives. Listen to that whisper. If you find yourself in a situation where someone is trying to weaken you to strengthen their position, pause. Ask yourself why strength would require your diminishment. Ask yourself why truth would need distortion. I once believed marriage meant loyalty no matter what. Now I understand loyalty without integrity is performance. Integrity without loyalty, however, is still integrity. I chose integrity, and it carried me through courtrooms, through betrayal, through public exposure, and into a life that feels stable not because it's perfect, but because it's honest. Today, when I walk past the framed graduation photo of Lily in the hallway, I feel pride, not just in her, but in myself. I navigated a dismantling without becoming dismantled. I faced public accusation without internalizing falsehood. I confronted a hidden life without losing my own. If you're listening and you're standing at your own kitchen counter with trembling hands, reading words that feel like they're erasing you, let me tell you something gently but firmly. You are not erased. You are being tested. And truth, even when delayed, has a way of entering the room at exactly the right time. Sometimes it walks in quietly, sometimes it carries documents, but when it arrives, it restores balance. Daniel tried to orchestrate a future that minimized me. Instead, he exposed the strength he underestimated. And the day that surprise witness stepped into the courtroom wasn't the day my marriage ended. It was the day I stopped doubting myself. That is the real ending. Not revenge, not ruin, but clarity. And clarity once claimed is a freedom no one can take from you again.